I was in so much judgment of myself for being weak and for being afraid and for having issues. I just could not accept that about myself. And I was so afraid of what everybody else was going to think, because here I left the church and everybody in my life was already thinking she's on the wrong track. She's sold out to Satan. She's going to hell. And here's the proof for them right in front of their face. Hello, friends. It's just me today. We are recording a solo podcast for the first time in quite a while. What I want to share with you today is that for my entire life, I had this idea of what enlightenment was, and it turned out to be the exact opposite. Like many people in our Western culture, I had this idea that enlightenment is transcendence of the physical world. And I think we maybe get this idea because we don't really have the whole context of the Eastern teachings of somebody who's maybe raised in India, for instance, might have. And so we sort of have this idea that's not really grounded in the full teaching and the full reality of what this path towards enlightenment really looks like. And we kind of stick it into our Western idea of what it is. So we picture yogis meditating in the Himalayas and we think they've transcended the world. They don't care about physical things anymore. And I was really into this mindset. And let me give you a little background onto all the things in my life that played into this. So first off, I was raised in what I would consider to be, at this point in my life, looking back, a cult. But I was raised in a really suppressive branch of Christianity. And we were taught that all people are by nature sinners. They can do nothing right on their own. They are totally depraved and incapable of doing anything but evil. And that God created 80% plus of the world's population simply for the purpose of burning in hell forever. And so basically, humanity itself is synonymous with the word sin in these circles. So humanity is seen as evil. Anything to do with our human nature is seen as something that needs to be overcome, suppressed, transcended, something that is worthy of eternal torture in hell. On top of that, my church was really steeped in purity culture teachings, which was extremely suppressive of sexuality and was really steeped in, which we'll get into later a little bit more, and the teachings of teachers like Bill Gothard and Dr. Dobson and Michael Pearl, which were extremely suppressive towards women and children. So in this church environment, I was not allowed to be human at all, or to be female, or to be a sexual being, or to have feelings. We were literally taught that we could not trust our heart because it was deceitful above all else, that we could not trust our feelings. We were not allowed to have feelings. Now, I'm not making any statement about my parents here. I leave my immediate family out of my videos always because that's private business. But I'm talking about the church setting as a whole. Is we were punished. Like, parents were encouraged to discipline their children for having feelings as if it was a bad thing. Like, we always had to have a good attitude with a smile on our face and obey immediately. So this is the environment that I was raised in. And so I learned to really judge so much myself, like everything about myself that was human, emotional, feminine, sexual, anything that I felt was weak or bad or wrong at a very young age. So when I was 19 years old, I left that church environment and I moved into a charismatic non-denominational church, which in many ways was a huge step up for me. But as with anything, there's going to be downsides. And one of the things about this church that was a downside for me, I mean, it was a good and a bad thing. So it was a Word of Faith church. And if for those of you who aren't familiar with Word of Faith, what is taught is that you have to believe and speak the promises of God so that you can manifest things in your life. Although I don't think they would use the word manifest. So it's basically law of attraction teachings wrapped in Christian language. And so I did experience a lot of supernatural things in the setting because it sort of raised me up out from where I had been and put me in a somewhat higher place where it taught me you do have power, your words have power, your thoughts have power, your intentions have power. But it was still in a very suppressive environment in certain ways. Because we were taught you can't think a negative thought, you can't say a negative word because that will affect your life negatively. And we were also taught if you're sick and you haven't received a healing, it's because you don't have enough faith. Now, I did receive several supernatural healings in these circles, so the teachings did benefit me to a point. But looking back on it, I can see that once I joined that church, and for, let's see, probably about at least a decade afterward, from the age of 19 until 29, when I had my major spiritual awakening and sort of began to leave Christianity. Not sort of, I did begin to leave Christianity. I was really, really strict and rigid with my mind and emotions. Did it serve me in a certain way? Yes, because I went from being severely depressed and dealing with anxiety and panic and all kinds of things to having 10 years of complete freedom from that because I didn't let any so-called negative thought or emotion into my consciousness at all. And I was happy and I was free and I felt empowered. And it was wonderful. So the point that I'm getting at is that I really got into a habit of still, even though I was in a higher place than I was before, I was still deeply suppressing anything that I considered to be negative about my humanity, my emotions, my thoughts, and I was still very much suppressing. I had really still ingrained into me everything that I had been taught about. It's shameful to be feminine. It's shameful to have a feminine figure. You need to be covered all the time. It's shameful to show or express femininity or sexuality at all. So all of this was still very much in me. As I went into my spiritual awakening and began to open up to ideas outside of the Christian faith. And of course, since I was a young child, I had been really drawn to Hindu teachings, but had never been allowed to explore them. So when I left the Christian church, I dove into the teachings of Hinduism and Buddhism, but really the teachings of enlightenment and the yogis, and starting to understand these paths. And I began to understand and even to teach, because I remember saying this over and over in my previous videos, that you can't suppress the human aspects of yourself, that there is no good and bad in ultimate reality, that you have to fully embrace the entire human experience because the entire experience is absolutely divine. And as I began to study near-death experiences, and I began to understand that literally everything is God embodied. And so I began talking about this, and I thought I believed it. And I would hear people talking online about spiritual bypassing and embodiment, which are things we'll get into if you're not familiar with those terms. And I would be like cheering them on and saying, yes, I agree, that's right. And I thought I got it, and I thought I understood. But I didn't. I didn't get it. I understood it intellectually, but it was not my lived experience. I was still suppressing so much of myself, and I couldn't even see it. And as I was voraciously pursuing a spiritual path, I was doing A Course in Miracles. I was obviously doing this channel where I'm interviewing near-death experiencers, and I'm having all of this information coming in, and I'm pursuing meditation, and I'm doing all of these things. What I believe happened now is that my momentum into my own spiritual awakening reached a point where it was coming up against the blockages in my energy system that were there because of the way that I was programming and all of the baggage I was carrying and all of my shadow that I was still suppressing, and I couldn't even see that I was doing it. And it forced me into some really difficult experiences that forced me to bring my shadow to the light. So before I get into those experiences, there's a couple of things that I want to point out, a couple of telltale signs that looking back now in my life, I can see were clearly there, that were showing that I was spiritually bypassing. I was suppressing my own shadow. Again, I couldn't see it at the time. I was preaching all of this stuff, and yet I couldn't see that I was doing this, that I wasn't living what I was speaking. I had no idea. But looking back, two really strong telltale signs is, number one, I was not comfortable with my negative emotions. And so if I experienced any sort of weakness, any sort of fear, any sort of anger, I would instantly try to transmute it into something, a higher emotion. And I would say, I'm not judging my emotion, but if it really came down to it, I was judging. I had an aversion to that part of myself because I would feel so much fear surrounding it. So if I had any type of emotion come up, like if I felt weak, even physically, emotionally, if I dealt with an overpowering fear, or if I had an anger towards someone that I couldn't seem to get past, then I would feel like I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing online because I'm not living my teaching. I'm feeling anger. I'm feeling fear. I'm feeling weak. Everybody's going to judge me because I'm not living up to my teaching. And see how like wrapped in spiritual / religious language that is. Like, it sounds good, like I should be living my teaching and I shouldn't be putting myself out there if I'm dealing with this anger. But hidden in that is the fact that I was judging having anger as wrong, and that I was judging myself for feeling weak. Another telltale sign is that I had a really hard time accepting anything that had to do with my humanity. For instance, I can't tell you the amount of times that I have said, I wish I didn't have to eat 3 meals a day because it is so much trouble and it takes up so much of my time to prepare these meals, and I would rather be doing something else. I would rather be doing something to make the world a better place rather than spending so much time preparing meals and eating. Or, which just sounds ridiculous to say out loud, but that's how I've been my entire life. I've just been so spiritually minded that I can't ground myself in reality. Another thing, and this is getting quite personal, but my husband is fine with me sharing this, is that I have had ongoing struggles with feeling disconnected from my sexuality, even in as a married woman, just feeling like, what's the point of this? Like, not having interest in it, because I was so disconnected from that side of myself that I would rather spend my time doing something to make the world a better place, than being intimate with my husband. And that just goes to show how disembodied I was. And I tried and tried and tried and tried to fix that. I got therapy. I did all the things. I read books, and nothing fixed it. And I came to the conclusion that this is just how it is. And I just had this idea that maybe it's more spiritual to not really be so connected to the needs of the body. Oh, how wrong I was. So now let's get into, let me see. I think there's 3 things I have written down here that I would like to talk about. Yes, 3 things that manifested into my life that life in its infinite wisdom and perfection put into my path and kind of forced me to have to go through so that I could heal these aspects of myself. So I could first realize that there was a problem and what I needed to do to fix it. So the first is something that I've talked about several times previously. And that was that after my deconstruction, about 3 years after I went public with my deconstruction, after dealing with the constant drama and criticism and manipulation and talking behind my back, and the way that people in my original faith community were reacting to my deconstruction, I began having a very, very difficult time. I had CPTSD that was triggered from my childhood, and I began experiencing overwhelming waves of panic. I used to have these waves of panic when I was a very young child, but I hadn't experienced it at all in my adult life, as I had completely, I thought, healed that aspect of me, but really I had just suppressed it when I was in the Word of Faith movement. So these overwhelming feelings of panic began coming up, and it terrified me. And I went through months where I was struggling just to get through the day. I know that that term can be thrown around sometimes and people say it, but I mean, I was struggling to get through the day. It was a moment by moment thing because I developed a panic disorder. I had a panic attack on the road while driving, and I was so intensely in fear of that happening again that I couldn't function. My husband had to take a couple of weeks off work because there were a couple of weeks I couldn't get out of bed. Now, some of that was due to the fact that the doctors tried putting me on anti-anxiety meds and I couldn't stay awake. That did not last very long. But I was so terrified of having another panic attack that I couldn't leave the house by myself. I was terrified of driving. I was terrified of driving by myself. I was terrified of being stuck in a car with someone else driving. I was terrified of being stuck in a line at the grocery store. I was terrified of being stuck in a drive-through, but I was also terrified of being home alone. I was scared of literally everything. And I began getting therapy. And it was the best thing that I could have ever done. Again, the universe gave me really clear instructions and put the exact right therapist right in front of me. And she basically told me, look, what the experiences that you're having are normal for someone who experienced a really repressive upbringing. And there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with you. But the way that you're going to get through this is that you have to accept the feelings. And she told me this. So this is very emotional for me because she told me this from the very beginning, but it was almost a year of me trying to accept the feelings before I actually figured out what that meant, because I was in so much judgment. I was in so much judgment of myself for being weak and for being afraid and for having issues. I just could not accept that about myself. And I was so afraid of what everybody else was going to think, because here I was, I left the church and everybody in my life was already thinking she's on the wrong track. She's sold out to Satan. She's going to hell. And here's the proof for them right in front of their face. Look at her. She's having panic attacks. She's got demonic entities influencing her now because of her life's choices. And it was really, really hard for me to get past the aversion to what I was going through and the judgment of myself and the fear of the fear. It was not until I was able to completely surrender into the fact that it is okay for me to feel this way. Not the fear is valuable because it will ultimately help me to experience joy, or because I can transmute it into something higher or some super spiritual sounding thing. No, the fear is okay as it is. It is okay for me to feel afraid. It is okay for me to need help. It is okay for me to look weak in front of others. There's nothing unspiritual about that. And it wasn't until I got to the place where I could fully surrender to that I started seeing progress. It wasn't to the point until I got to the point where I needed to say, "Oh, I'm doing better. I'm over it," to feel good about myself. But now I can say, I'm I may experience fear in my life again. I'm human, and that's okay. And I can be okay with saying that. And that's when it loses its grip on you. So that was my first experience of becoming embodied, which was really very forcefully put into my path because I was not going to go there on my own. The next thing that happened is that I began dealing with a lot of anger. And that makes sense because if we're talking about how the energy moves up through the body, um, fear is more of a safety issue, which has to do with the lower energy centers. And then anger is more of an empowerment issue, which has to do with the solar plexus center. So perhaps energy is moving up through my system. And I began dealing with so much anger. And here's the thing, guys, this is another telltale sign. I was never an angry person. I never really felt anger. I never really expressed anger. Okay, there were some times when my husband could really make me mad, but that's just a marriage thing. Generally speaking, I never felt or expressed anger. What's the reason for that? Could it possibly be because I was suppressing my anger all those years? Another thing is that I was really uncomfortable with anybody else being angry at me. Now, there are some other reasons for this. I definitely was hurt by anger as a child. I was in some abusive situations that involved anger, and which further caused me to suppress my own anger. But I was very uncomfortable with anybody being angry, couldn't stand to have, my husband or my kids expressing anger without me feeling obligated to do something to fix it or make it stop. Another telltale sign that I was suppressing my anger. So I had a lot of pent up anger over what happened when I deconstructed and how all of that went down in my community. And I felt like because I'm, putting myself out there online spiritually, and at the time I was actually teaching, I have gotten away from that because I've been focusing more on the podcast, but I was teaching and I'm saying, if I'm putting myself out there as a spiritual teacher and yet I'm dealing with all this anger, then I'm a hypocrite. So again, I wasn't expressing, I wasn't accepting my anger, and I wasn't allowing it to do what it needed to do. And I kept trying to just forgive and just make it go away. Like I thought I should be able to just instantly forgive these people and instantly make it go away, or I wasn't spiritual enough. I did figure out how to do that. We'll get to that in a minute. But my husband and I ended up moving, not because of what happened in our previous location with my deconstruction, but for other reasons. So we ended up moving across country to where we were. And I thought for sure when we are gone and we're in a new location, I can just start over, my anger will dissipate. Well, it didn't. It got stronger and stronger and stronger until I was starting to feel like, why am I angry all the time? And I'm angry. I'm starting to get angry at, people and things in my life here that had nothing to do with the original reason why I was angry, because I was just so angry and my anger had no outlet. And eventually I got to the point where I realized, wait a minute, I had to accept my fear to heal that. to heal the fear. Maybe I need to do the same thing with my anger. So I started allowing myself to just be angry and to say it is okay to feel the anger. It's a divine energy that's flowing through my body that's empowering me, telling me that I was wrong, ensuring that I set boundaries, that I make healthy choices on who I allow myself in the future. And this is God expressing as this energy through me. And I can feel it and let it be okay and express itself without causing harm to anybody else. Just feel it and accept it and say, I'm angry, and that's okay. And believe it or not, as soon as I did that, the anger started to dissipate. And I had an epiphany when that happened. I realized that when I finally accepted my anger and my anger went away, a lot of things went away with it. For instance, my ability to be offended by those people went away with it. Why is that? Because in accepting my anger, I had fully accepted myself, a part of myself that I was suppressing. And because I was accepting myself, I no longer needed these other people to do anything to make me feel secure or happy. So if they don't like the path that I'm on, if they're doing this or saying that behind my back, who cares? How does it affect me? And now I'm able to feel that way. So originally I was saying I wanted to be able to dissipate my anger quickly because I thought that would be more spiritual, and I couldn't do it because I was suppressing my anger. The key to actually dissipating your anger quickly is to just accept it. Because when you accept it, you accept yourself, and you no longer need anything from that other person who made you angry. So it doesn't matter to you anymore. So that was quite an epiphany for me to have. I also, the need to distance myself, although it's still important to have healthy boundaries, but that feeling like I need distance from this person so that I can heal, that kind of went away with it too, because it's like, well, I don't need or not need anything from this person anymore because I've accepted myself. I've grounded myself. I've allowed myself to be empowered, to be a full being. Moving on to the third situation that was thrust in front of me was that I watched the docu-series Shiny Happy People. I believe it's on Amazon Prime, and I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe that it is free. And while I will say it is super triggering for anybody who was raised in a cult-like church environment, it really opened my eyes to some things. So, spoiler alert, I am going to share some things from that documentary. Just to sum up the effect that that documentary had on me, is I learned that my childhood church, while it was not affiliated, for anybody who doesn't know, the documentary is about the Duggar family and their cult, which was run by Bill Gothard. Okay, so I learned that my childhood church was deeply influenced by Bill Gothard's teachings. Now, as far as I'm aware, they were not associated with Bill Gothard, but it would seem that his teachings have somehow infiltrated into mainstream Christianity. So our church promoted so many things. As I was watching that documentary, it was like every single thing that came up that the Duggars were teaching their children that came from Bill Gothard, our church also taught. So things like the umbrella of protection. I don't know if any of you have seen that graphic where it shows the big umbrella, which is, I think it's Jesus, it's God or Jesus. And underneath that is a smaller umbrella, which is the man. And underneath that is the women and the children. And the teaching is that the woman needs to stay under the umbrella of authority and be submissive to her husband, because if she doesn't, then she's opening herself up to the attack of the devil. Our church taught that. And with that, so many things. Another thing that came up in the documentary was about eye traps and how women in that environment are taught not to dress in certain ways. So you couldn't have a V-neck shirt, you couldn't have a slit on your skirt, you couldn't have certain designs on your clothing, you couldn't stand in a certain way. Our church taught this. You couldn't flip your hair over your shoulder. You couldn't blink your eyes too many times. You could not have your bra strap showing. Couldn't wear a bikini. Your shirt couldn't be too tight because you were going to cause a guy to stumble. And girls were taught that this is their fault. Guys can't help it. If they look at a woman, they will automatically lust. And that is the woman's fault for not remaining covered. So many other things, like the fact that they started spanking children as babies and toddlers. And that children were taught this phrase: to delay is to disobey. So you are to do as you're told with a smile on your face instantly. And that was basically the rule for women and children. I mean, I remember being told that if I did not find a suitable husband, that I should be a stay-at-home daughter so that I remained under the protection of my father. But what they really meant by that was the authority of my father, that women and children needed to do what they were told. We were taught in our church that the woman is to worship the man as the man worships God. So anyway, all of this stuff is being brought back up, and I'm realizing the level of indoctrination that happened and the level of suppression of femininity and sexuality that I underwent. And it was like, in realizing these things, I was completely set free from it, because what comes out in the documentary is that Bill Gothard, the one who wrote these rules that all of evangelical Christianity, or fundamentalist Christianity anyway, is following on how women and children are to behave, turned out to be a serial rapist and child molester. And so the one who's writing the rule book and telling women how they should dress so they don't cause a man to lust for them, who's telling women that they need to bow down and obey the men in their lives, is grooming women and taking them to his office at night and raping them and molesting children. And it's like, clearly these rules had nothing to do with morality. And here's the thing though, I had forgotten about a lot of this. I did not consciously believe any of this rhetoric for years, ever since I left my childhood church when I was 19, but it was still so ingrained in me that it was running my life, and having it brought to light just completely allowed those layers to fall off of me. And I had sort of this second deconstruction when I realized, wait a minute, I get to discover who I am now as a human, as a woman, as a sexual being. And I was able to finally start connecting with those sides of me, and to lose the shame about having to feel like if I'm not covered, or if I care too much about eating or having sex or going to the gym or anything that has to do with my physical body, anything that has to do with being sexual or being a woman or being human, then I'm not spiritual enough. And it was like the veil came off of my eyes, and all of a sudden I could see that being human and being a woman or a man, being sexual, having feelings, having sensations, is spiritual. It is the whole point. It's the reason we're here. And I could see it for the first time because the guilt associated with it was gone after going through and accepting my fear, going through and accepting my anger, and then having Bill Gothard's teachings about suppression of women and children and sexuality outed, it was like the guilt associated with these things was finally gone. And I could see that this human experience that we're having on an experiential, lived level, I could finally experience it as divine. So if you are still with me, thank you for sticking with me through my story. I am going to wrap this up here. And I just want to share a little bit about this new human experience that I'm having now. I'm having a completely new experience of what it means to be human and what it means to be divine, and how those two things are absolutely the same thing. They are two sides of the same coin. We come here to experience humanity. So on my spiritual journey, like I said, I've pursued A Course in Miracles, and I've done a lot of self-inquiry meditation. I've been doing that for several years now. And those two things combined really helped me to hone in on my sense of self, my divine I am presence, separate from the body, and to find a pillar of presence and peace and stillness within me. But the thing is that that pillar of presence and peace and stillness was completely overwhelmed by the things that I was not accepting. So when the fear came up, I couldn't connect to that stillness anymore. When the anger would come up, I couldn't connect to the stillness. When the shame over my sexuality would come up, I couldn't connect to the stillness. And that is another huge sign that I was not embodied, that I was bypassing. For a while when I was on my spiritual path, I was afraid that if I kept transcending and transcending and transcending and connecting deeper and deeper to the stillness and the spirit within me, that I was going to lose interest in the physical world altogether, and that I was just going to want to go be a yogi in the mountains and stop caring about my career and my, the day-to-day things of life. But I turned out to be completely wrong. Actually, the spiritual path, when it is followed in a whole and embodied way, brings you into the present. Another way that I discovered this was through continuing to do self-inquiry meditation, because eventually I reached a point when I kept trying to bring myself back to the present moment awareness in the sense of I am, that I stopped being able to pin it down. The sense of I was becoming more and more and more elusive. So what I finally did is I looked beyond the sense of I to see what was there, and I discovered a vast ocean of beingness. And that beingness was the pure present moment experience of everything. Without judgment and without attachment, just being and experiencing. Like, I'm along for the ride. Let's immerse ourselves in this. And it was so beautiful. And as I followed that form of self-inquiry meditation, of identifying not with the self, but with the non-self, I've found that I've become more and more and more embodied, because we come into the body to have experience, to have rich, diverse, contrasted, dualistic experiences that we can't have in higher realms of love and light. Which leads me to one of my points. I would propose to you that enlightenment is not transcendence of the physical world, although that language can in some ways be useful. It can also be very misleading. I would propose that enlightenment instead is the full immersion into the experience of duality, into the experience of humanity without attachment to it. So fully enjoying and experiencing and accepting all of it without judging it, without needing any of it to make you who you are, without dependency on any of it, without attachment or aversion to any of it, just drinking it in, just fully accepting it, just letting it be what it is. I would go so far to say that the dualistic physical world is the only place where we can actually experience enlightenment. Because think about it. No one needs to be enlightened in higher realms of love and light where everything is perfect, in those realms where near-death experiencers say that we all came from. How would you become enlightened in a place where everything is already light? Enlightenment isn't, I'm going to propose, it's just my proposition. Enlightenment isn't a concept that exists there. Because what do you need to be enlightened from? I would say enlightenment can only be experienced where there is contrast. Because enlightenment is the experience of immersing yourself into the contrast without identifying with it. So enlightenment is the experience of recognizing not only light as light, but darkness as an aspect of light. And letting that darkness be okay as it is. Not only joy as joy, like I was doing in the Word of Faith movement, I can only think joyful thoughts, but experiencing sorrow as a component of joy. And letting joy and sorrow coexist together and letting that be okay. Experiencing not only God as God, but humanity as also God. A valuable, infinitesimally valuable divine experience, because here, only here can we experience those aspects of God. What does divinity look like for me, practically speaking now? Well, it still looks like all the things that it did before when I was preaching that this whole human experience is divine. So it still looks like walking barefoot in the grass and feeling the sensation of the dewy grass on my bare feet. It still looks like taking a cold shower and feeling the sensation of the ice cold water on my skin. It still looks like hearing my cats purr in my ears and kissing my children and tasting chocolate and smelling the roses that grow behind my house. All the absolutely beautiful, positive, divine experiences that it's easy to look at the human experience and say, oh yeah, that's divine. Obviously, that's divine. Music and dancing and eating pizza and looking at the stars and connecting with a loved one. It's all divine. But also, it looks like being angry, feeling that energy of anger flow through my energy centers. It looks like being weak and letting someone else take care of me. It looks like needing to rest, needing help, feeling the feelings of heartbreak and grief and fear, feeling inadequate, having other people judge me, and letting that be okay. When you can experience these things without judgment, without aversion to the experience, and that's the key, without attaching stories or meaning to it, with total love and acceptance of how you feel in that experience, then, my friend, you have met God. That's when, in the words of Jesus, the kingdom of heaven, which is laid out on the earth all around you, everywhere, will suddenly become visible to you. And you will realize in awe that it has been there the whole time. You just couldn't see it. And that's when you will fully anchor divinity in this body with your awareness of it. That's when you become your most authentic, powerful self. And although I am not a master or a sage, and I'm not claiming to be enlightened, I would dare to say that that's what enlightenment is. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for watching the Love Covered Life podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and comment with your thoughts and opinions, and check the description box for the links to my free community where I share lots of resources, my Pay What You Can community where we do classes and challenges together, my TikTok, Instagram, my Clips channel, and lovecoveredlife.com where I share my paintings. Thank you so much for your support.